Okay, so chapter 10. No, chapter 11. I don't know where that is in your book, but I'll give you a second. It's Castle Rock. And so chapter 10 ends when they had stolen Piggy's glasses after raiding them. So chapter 11, Castle Rock. In the short chill before dawn, the four boys gathered round the black smudge where the fire had been, while Ralph knelt and blew. Gray, feathery ashes scurried hither and thither until his at a breath, but no spark shone among them. The twins watched anxiously, and Piggy sat expressionless behind the luminous wall of myopia. Ralph continued to blow till his ears were stained with the effort, and in the first breeze of dawn took the job off his hand and blinded him with the ash. He squatted back, swore, and rubbed water out of his eyes. No use. Eric looked down at him through a mask of dried blood, and Piggy peered in the general direction of Ralph. Of course it's no use, Ralph. We've got no fire. And Ralph brought his face within a couple feet of Piggy's. Can you see me? A bit. Ralph allowed the swollen flap of his cheek to close his eyes again. They've got our fire, and rage shrilled in his voice. They stole it. That's them, said Piggy. They blinded me, see? That's Jack Merridew. You call an assembly, Ralph. We got to decide what to do. An assembly for only us? It's all we got. Sam, let me hold on to you. They went towards the platform. Blow the conch, said Piggy. Blow as loud as you can. And the forest re-echoed. The birds lifted, cried out of the treetops, and on that first morning ages ago. Both ways of the beach was deserted. Some little ones came from the shelters, and Ralph sat down on the polished trunk as the three others sat before him. He nodded, and Sam and Eric sat down on the right. Sam pushed the conch into Piggy's hands. He held the shining thing carefully and then blinked at Ralph. Go on, then. I just take the conch to say this. I can't see no more, and I got to get my glasses back. Awful things have been done on this island. I voted you for chief. He's the only one who ever got anything done. So now you speak, Ralph, or tell us what, or us. And Piggy broke off, sniveling. Ralph took back the conch as he sat down. Just an ordinary fire. You'd think we could do that, wouldn't you? Just a smoke fire so that we could be rescued. Are we savages or what? Yes, we are. Only now there's no signal going up. Ships may be passing. You remember how we went hunting and the fire went out and a ship passed by? And they all think he's best as chief. Then there was that's his fault too. If it hadn't been for him, it would have never have happened. Now Piggy can't see, and they came stealing. Ralph's voice ran up. At night, in darkness, and stole our fire. They stole it. We'd have given them fire if they'd asked, but they stole it, and the signal's out, and we can't ever be rescued. Do you see what I mean? We'd have given them fire for themselves, only they stole it. He paused lamely as the curtain flickered in his brain. Piggy held out his hand for the conch. What are you going to do, Ralph? This is just us talking without deciding. I want my glasses. I'm trying to think. Supposing we go, looking like we used to, washed and hairbrushed. After all, we aren't savages, really, and being rescued isn't a game. He opened the flap of his cheek and looked at the twins. We could smarten up a bit and then go. We have to take spears, said Sam, even Piggy, because we may need them. You haven't got the conch. So even still, he's trying to maintain that democracy and that rule of law. Piggy held up the shell. You can take spears if you want, but I shan't. What's the good? I'll have to be led like a dog anyhow. Yes, laugh. Go on, laugh. There's them on this island as would laugh at anything. And what happened? What grown-up's going to think? Young Simon was murdered. And there was another kid that had the mark on his face. Who's seen him since we first come here? Piggy, stop a minute. I got the conch, and I'm going to that Jack Merridew and tell him. I am. You'll get hurt. What can he do more than he has? I'll tell him what's what. You let me carry the conch, Ralph. I'll show him the one thing he hasn't got. And Piggy paused for a moment and then peered round at the dim figures. The shape of the old assembly, trodden in the grass, listened to him. I'm going to him with the conch in my hands. I'm going to hold it out. Look, I'm going to say, you're stronger than I am, and you haven't got asthma. You can see, I'm going to say, and with both eyes, but I don't ask for my glasses back. Not as a favor. I don't ask you to be a sport, I'll say. Not because you're strong, but because what's right's right. Give me my glasses, I'm going to say. You've got to. So again, Piggy still hold on to this ideology, right? That like, you have to do what's right, not necessarily like what, you don't get the right because you're strong or something. Piggy ended, flushed and trembled. He pushed the conch quickly into Ralph's hands, as though in a hurry to be rid of it, and then wiped tears from his eyes. The green light was gentle about them, and the conch lay at Ralph's feet, fragile and white. A single drop of water that had escaped Piggy's finger now flashed on the delicate curve like a star. And I want to quickly just go back to how they just described the conch. So normally when we see this conch shell, we see it's talked a lot about how, it's this really shiny, bright thing and it's really gorgeous. In this time, what they said was that, the conch was fragile and white. So this rule of law is very fragile, is what that's referencing to right there. At last, Ralph sat up straight and drew back his hair. All right, I mean, you can try if you'd like. We'll go with you. He'll be painted, said Sam timidly. You know how he'll be. Again, when he's painted, that's a mask for his cruelty. If you think about, has anyone here ever been a dick to someone on the internet because you're anonymous? Probably. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm innocent either. It's a mask, right? You act differently behind that anonymity. And so that's how Jack acts as well. He won't think much of us, and if he gets waxy, we've had it. Ralph scowled at Sam. Dimly, he remembered something that Simon had said to him once by the rocks. Don't be silly, he said, and then he added quickly, let's go. He held out the conch to Piggy, who flushed, this time with pride. You must carry it. When we're ready, I'll carry it. And Piggy sought in his mind for words to convey his passionate willingness to carry the conch against all odds. I don't mind. I'll be glad, Ralph. I'll have to be led. Ralph put the conch back on the shining log. We better eat and then get ready. They made their way to the devastated fruit trees. Piggy was helped to his food and found some by touch. While they ate, Ralph thought of the afternoon. We'll be like we were. We'll wash. Sam gulped down a mouthful and protested. But we bathe every day. Ralph looked at the filthy object before him and sighed. We ought to comb our hair, only it's too long. I've got both socks left in the shelter, said Eric, so we could pull them over our head like caps and stuff. We could find some stuff, said Biggie, and tie your hair back like a girl. No, of course not. Then we must go as we are, and they won't be any better. And Eric had made a detaining gesture. But they'll be painted. You know how it is. And the others nodded. They understood only too well the liberation into savagery that concealing paint brought. Again, that anonymity, right? You pretend to be something that you're not, or you don't feel shame at letting those inner feelings out. So again, they understood too well the liberation into savagery that the concealing paint brought. The nighttime does this as well. Well, we won't be painted, said Ralph, because we aren't savages. And Sam and Eric looked at each other. All the same, Ralph shouted, no paint. He tried to remember. Smoke, he said. We want smoke. And he turned on the twins fiercely. I said, smoke. We've got to have smoke. And there was silence, except for the multitudinous murmur of the bees. And at last, Piggy spoke kindly. Of course we have, because the smoke's a signal, and we can't be rescued if we don't have a signal, if we don't have smoke. I know that, said Ralph, and he pulled his arm away from Piggy. Are you suggesting? I'm just saying what you always said Piggy hastily. I thought for a moment. I hadn't, said Ralph loudly. I knew all the time. I hadn't forgotten. Piggy nodded propitiationally. You're Chief Ralph. You remember everything. I hadn't forgotten. Of course not. The twins were examining Ralph curiously, as though they were seeing him for the first time. They set off along the beach in formation. Ralph went first, limping a little, his spear carried over one shoulder. He saw things partially through the tremble of the heat haze on the flashing sands, and his own long hair and injuries. And behind him came the twins, worried now for a while, but full of unquenchable vitality. They said little, but they trailed the butts of their wooden spears, for Piggy had found that looked down, shielding his tired sight from the eyes, he could just see these moving along the sand. He walked between the trail and butts, therefore, the conch held carefully between his two hands. The boys made a compact little group that moved along the beach, 4 plate-like shadows dancing and mingling beneath them. There was no sign left of this storm, and the beach was swept clean like a blade that had been scoured. The sky and the mountain were at an immense distance, shimmering in the heat, and the reef was lifted by the mirage, floating in a kind of silver pool halfway up the sky. They passed the place where the tribe had danced. The charred little sticks lay on the rocks where the rain had quenched them, but the sand by the water was smooth again. They passed this in silence. No one doubted that the tribe would be found at Castle Rock, and when they came in sight of it, they stopped with one accord. The tensest tangle on the island, a mass of twisted stems, black and green and impenetrable, lay on their left, and the tall grass swayed before them. And now Ralph went forward. Here was the crushed grass where they had all lain, where he had gone to prospect. There was the neck of the land, the ledge skirting the rock, and up there were the red pinnacles. And Sam touched his arm. Smoke. There was a tiny smudge of smoke wavering through the air on the other side of the rock. Some fire, I don't think. Ralph turned. What are we hiding for? He stepped through the screen of grass on the little open space that led to the narrow neck. You two follow behind. I'll go first, then Piggy a pace behind me. Keep your spears ready. Piggy peered anxiously into the luminous veil that hung between him and the world. Is it safe? Ain't there a cliff? I can hear the sea. You kept close to me. Ralph moved forward on the neck, and he kicked a stone and it bounded into the water. Then the sea sucked down, revealing a red, weedy square 40 feet beneath Ralph's left arm. Am I safe? Quivered Piggy. I feel awful. High above them from the pinnacles came a sudden shout and then an imitation war cry that was answered by a dozen voices behind the rock. Give me the conch and stay still. Halt, who goes there? And Ralph bent back his head and glimpsed Roger's dark face at the top. You can see who I am, he shouted. Stop being silly. And so before we continue forward, so right now he's talking to Roger, right? Roger, if we recall, was someone who is really, really shy. That's all we really know about him. He's very reluctant to speak. He's not very bold. He's shy. You can see who I am, he shouted. Stop being silly. And he put the conch to his lips and began to blow. Savages appeared, painted out of recognition, edging around ledges towards the neck. They carried spears and disposed themselves to defend the entrance, and Ralph went on blowing and ignored Piggy's terror. Roger was shouting, you mind out, see? At last, Ralph took his lips away and paused to get his breath back. His first words were a gasp, but audible, calling in assembly. And the savages guarding the neck muttered among themselves, but made no motion. And Ralph walked forward a couple steps, and a voice whispered urgently behind him, don't leave me, Ralph. You kneel down, said Ralph sideways, and wait till I come back. He stood halfway along the neck and gazed at the savages intently. Freed by paint, they had tied their hair back and were more comfortable than he was. Ralph had made a resolution to tie his own hair back afterwards. Indeed, he felt like telling them to wait and doing it there and then, but that was impossible. The savages sniggered a bit, and one gestured at Ralph with his spear. High above, Roger took his hands off the lever and leaned out to see what was going on. If you remember what that lever is, that's going to come into play soon. The boys on the neck stood in the pool of their own shadow, diminished to saggy heads, and Piggy crouched, his back shapeless as a sack. I'm calling an assembly. Silence. Piggy took up a small stone and flung it between the twins, aiming to miss. They started, and Sam only just kept his foot in. Some source of power began to pulse in Roger's body. Ralph spoke again, loudly. I'm calling an assembly, and he ran his eyes over them. Where's Jack? The group of voices stirred and consulted, and a painted face spoke with the voice of Robert. He's hunting, and he said we weren't to let you in. So it's important to know right now that Robert is Jack's right-hand man at this point. I've come to see you about the fire, said Ralph, and about Piggy's specs. The group in front of them shifted, and the laughter shivered outwards from among them. Light, excited laughter that went echoing among the tall rocks, and a voice spoke from behind Ralph. What do you want? The twins made a bolt past Ralph and got between him and the entry. He turned quickly, but Jack, identifiable by his personality and red hair, was advancing from the forest. A hunter crouched on either side. All three were masked in black and green, and behind them, on the grass, the headless and paunched body of a sow lay where they had dropped it. And Piggy wailed, Ralph, don't leave me. With ludicrous care, he embraced the rock, pressing himself to it above the sucking sea, and the sniggering of the savages became a loud, derisive jeer. And Jack shouted above the noise, you go away, Ralph. You keep to your end. This is my end and my tribe. You leave me alone. And the jeering died away. You pinched Piggy's specs, said Ralph breathlessly. You've got to give them back. Got to? Says who? And Ralph's temper blazed out. I say, you voted me for chief. Didn't you hear the conch? You played a dirty trick. We'd have given you fire if you'd asked for it. And the blood was flowing in his cheeks, and the bunged up eye throbbed. You could have fire whenever you wanted, but you didn't. You came sneaking up like a thief and stole Piggy's glasses. Say that again. Thief, thief. And Piggy screamed, Ralph, mind me. Jack had made a rush and stabbed at Ralph's chest. Jack had made a rush and stabbed at Ralph's chest with his spear. So he's trying to stab him now with the spear. So again, we've escalated into violence. Ralph had sensed the position of the weapon from the glimpse, and he caught Jack's arm and put the thrust aside with his own butt. And then he brought the end round and caught Jack a stinger from the ear. They were chest to chest, breathing fiercely, pushingly, and glaring. Who's a thief? You are. And Jack wrenched free and swung at Ralph with a spear. By common consent, they were using the spears as sabers now, no longer daring the lethal points. The blow struck Ralph's spear and slid down to fall agonizingly on his fingers. And then they were apart once more, their positions reversed. Jack towards Castle Rock and Ralph on the outside towards the island. But both boys were breathing very heavily. Come on then, come on. Truculently, they squared up to each other, but kept just out of fighting distance. You come and see what you get. You come on. Piggy, clutching the ground, was trying to attract Ralph's attention. Ralph moved, bent down, and kept a wary eye on Jack. Ralph, remember what we came for, the fire, my specs. And Ralph nodded. He relaxed his fighting muscles, stood easily, and grounded the butt of his spear. So again, he's trying to deny this savagery. It's really easy to get sucked into this fight. He's denying that. Jack had watched him with inscrutability through his paint, and Ralph glanced up at the pinnacles, then towards the group of savages. Listen, we've come to say this. First, you've got to give Piggy's glasses. If he hasn't got them, he can't see. You aren't playing the game. And the tribe of painted savages giggled, and Ralph's mind faltered. He pushed his hair up and gazed at the green and black mass before him, trying to remember what Jack looked like. And Piggy whispered, and the fire. Oh, yes, and then about the fire. I say this again. I've been saying it since we dropped in. He held out his spear and pointed at the savages. Your only hope is keeping a signal fire going as long as there's light to see. Then maybe a ship will notice the smoke and come and rescue us and take us home. But without that smoke, we've got to wait till some ship comes by accident. We might wait years till we're old. And the shivering, silvery, unreal laughter of the savages sprayed out and echoed away. A gust of rage shook Ralph, and his voice cracked. Don't you understand, you painted fools? Sam, Eric, Piggy, and me, we aren't enough. We tried to keep the fire going, but we couldn't. And then you, playing at hunting. Again, he's viewing this whole thing as a game. He painted past them with a trickle of smoke dispersed in the pearly air. Look at that. Call that a signal fire? That's a cooking fire. Now you'll eat and there'll be no smoke. Don't you understand? There may be a ship up there. And he paused, defeated by the silence and the painted anonymity of the group guarding the entry. The chief opened a pink mouth and addressed Sam and Eric, who were between him and his tribe. You two, get back. No one answered him. The twins, puzzled, looked at each other, while Piggy, reassured by the cessation of violence, stood up carefully. Jack glanced back at Ralph and then at the twins. Grab them. No one moved, and Jack shouted angrily, I said grab them. And the painted group moved Sam and Eric nervously and unhandedly. Once more, the silvery laughter scattered, and Sam and Eric protested out of the heart of civilization. Oh, I say, honestly. Their spears were taken from them. Tie them up. Ralph cried hopelessly against the black and green mask. Jack, go on, tie them. Now the painted group felt the otherness of Sam and Eric, felt the power in their own hands. They felt the twins clumsily and excitedly, and Jack was inspired. Again, they felt the power in their own hands. He knew that Ralph would attempt a rescue. He struck in a hammer circle behind him, and Ralph only just parried the blow. Beyond them, the tribe and the twins were a loud and writhing heap, and Piggy crouched again. And then then the twins lay, astonished, and the tribe stood around them. Jack turned to Ralph and spoke between his teeth. See, they do what I want. So he uses violence to control. There was a silence, and the twins lay inexpertly tied up, and the tribe watched Ralph to see what he would do. He numbered them through his fringe, glimpsed the ineffectual smoke, and his temper broke. He screamed at Jack, you're a beast and a swine and a bloody, bloody thief. And he charged. So again, he descends back into savagery. Jack, knowing this was the crisis, charged too. They met with a jolt and bounced apart. Jack swung with his fist at Ralph and caught him on the ear. Ralph hit Jack in the stomach and made him grunt. Then they were facing each other again, panting and furious, but unnerved by each other's ferocity. They became aware of the noise that was the background of this fight, the steady shrill cheering of the tribe behind them, and Piggy's voice penetrated to Ralph. Let me speak. He was standing in the dust of the fight, and the tribe saw his intention. And as the tribe saw his intention, the shrill cheer changed to a steady booing. And Piggy held up the conch, and the booing sagged a little, and then came up to strength. I got the conch, he shouted. I tell you, I got the conch. And surprisingly, there was silence now. The tribe was curious to hear what amusing thing he might have to say. Silence and pause, but in the silence, a curious air noise, close by Ralph's head. He gave it half his attention, and there it was again, a faint zup. Someone was throwing stones. Roger was dropping them, his one hand still on the lever, and below them, Ralph was a shock of hair and Piggy a bag of fat. So I want to pause there and quickly talk about throwing the stones. We've seen this throughout the story, and this does have some significance. Roger specifically has been the one who has thrown the stones all throughout the story. At the very start, in the first chapters, when they're playing in like the water, it was like chapter 2 or 3. Roger's throwing stones at the twins, and he's purposely trying to like throw them like 6 meters away from them. Right? It was mentioned how he knows he's not supposed to go with them there. And then we just saw it mentioned a couple pages ago as well. He's throwing stones at them, but again, he's purposely aiming to miss. This time, they're throwing stones one more time. This time, however, there is not a goal to miss. I got this to say. You're acting like a crowd of kids. And the Booin rose and died again as Piggy lifted the white magic shell. Which is better, to be a to be a pack of painted like you are, or to be sensible like Ralph is? And a great clamor rose among the savages, and Piggy shouted again, which is better, to have rules and agree, or to hunt and to kill? And again the clamor, and again zup, which is rock thrown. And Ralph shouted above the noise, which is better, law and rescue, or hunting and breaking things up? And now Jack was yelling too, and Ralph could no longer make himself heard. Jack had backed right up against the tribe, and they were a solid mass of menace that bristled with spears, and were intention of a charge that was forming among them. And they were working up to it, and the neck would be swept clear. Ralph stood facing them, a little to one side, his spear ready, and by him stood Piggy, still holding out the talisman, the fragile, shining beauty of the shell. And the storm of the sound beat at them, and an incantation of hatred. High overhead, Roger, with a sense of delirious abandonment, leaned all his weight on the lever. So Roger, with a sense of delirious abandonment, leaned all of his weight against the lever. Ralph had heard the great rock long before he saw it. He was aware of the jolt on the earth that came to him through the soles of his feet, and the breaking sounds of stone at the top of the cliff. And then the monstrous red thing bounded across the neck, and he flung himself flat while the tribe shrieked. The rock struck Piggy, a glancing blow from chin to knee. The conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. Piggy, saying nothing, with no time for even a grunt, traveled through the air sideways from the rock, turning over as he went. The rock bounded twice and was lost at the forest, and Piggy fell 40 feet and landed on his back across that square red rock in the sea. His head opened and stuff came out and turned red. Piggy's arms and legs twitched a bit, like a pig's after it had been killed, and then the sea breathed again in a long, slow sigh. The water boiled white and pink over the rock, and when it went sucking back again, the body of Piggy was gone. And so we see that Roger, in this case, has murdered Piggy by using that rock with the lever. This time, the silence was complete. Ralph's lip formed a word, but no sound came from. And suddenly, Jack bounded out from the tide and began screaming wildly. See, that's what you'll get. I meant that. There isn't a tribe for you anymore. The conch is gone. The conch is gone. So again, the conch shattered. That symbolizes that all hope that they had of like a civilization of rule and order gone. It's destroyed. And again, this is when it really drives home to Ralph that, oh my God, like they're unsavable at this point, right? And without even a moment's like hesitation, Jack, isn't sorry or shocked anymore, like just how they were with Simon. Instead, he's just, yep, look at that. See, that's what you get. So at this point, we're unrecoverable. The conch is gone, and he ran forward, stooping, I'm chief. And viciously, with full intention, he hurled his spear at Ralph. The point tore the skin and flesh over Ralph's ribs. So what does he do? He throws a spear at him. He attempts to murder him again. And then sheared off and fell in the water. Ralph stumbled, feeling not a pain, but panic. And then the tribe, screaming now like the chief, began to advance. Another spear, a bent one that would not fly straight, went past his face, and one fell from on high where Roger was. So Jack and Roger are like the main people who've escalated this, but now other people are joining in, right? There were 3 spears that were thrown. There's at least one other person now who's actively trying to kill Ralph. The twins lay hidden behind the tribe, and the anonymous devils' faces swarmed across the neck. Ralph turned and ran, and a great noise of seagulls rose behind him. He obeyed an instinct that he did not know he possessed, and swerved over the open space so that the spears went wide. He saw the headless body of a sow and jumped in time. Then he went crashing through the foliage and small boughs and was hidden by the forest. The chief stopped by the pig, turned and held up his hands, back to the fort, and presently the tribe returned noisily to the neck where Roger joined them. The chief spoke to him angrily. "Why aren't you on watch?" And Roger looked at him gravely. "I just came down." And the hangman's horror clung to him. The chief said no more to him, but he looked down at Sam and Eric. "You got to join the tribe. You let me go, and me." The chief snatched one of the spears that were left and poked Sam in the ribs. "What do you mean by it, eh?" the chief said fiercely. "What do you mean by coming with spears? What do you mean by not joining my tribe?" And the prodding became rhythmic, and Sam yelled, "That's not the way." Roger edged past the chief, only just avoiding pushing him with his shoulder, and the yelling ceased, and Sam and Eric lay looking up in quiet terror. Roger advanced upon them as one wielding a nameless authority. So we will learn more about Roger and what he's capable of in our final chapter here. So chapter 12. So again, at this point, this is the last chapter of the novel, and in chapter 11 is like, this is it. We've turned the point. There's no coming back at this point. There's intentional attempts at murder now, and one has been successful. Excuse me 1 second, drink some water. Okay, so chapter 12. Ralph lay in a covert, wondering about his wounds. His bruised flesh was inches in diameter over his right ribs, with a swollen and bloody scar where the spear had hit him. His hair was full of dirt and tapped like a tendril of a creeper. All over, he was scratched and bruised from his flights through the forest. By the time his breathing was normal again, he had worked out that bathing these injuries would have to wait. How could you listen for naked feet if you were splashing in water? How could you be safe by the little stream or on the open beach? And Ralph listened. He was not really far from Castle Rock, and during the first panic, he had thought he heard sounds of pursuit, but the hunters had only sneaked into the fringes of the greenery, retrieving spears perhaps, and then rushed back towards the sunny rock as if terrified of the darkness under the leaves. He had glimpsed one of them, striped brown, black, and red, and judged that it was Bill. But really, thought Ralph, this was not Bill. This was a savage whose image had refused to blend with that ancient picture of a boy in shorts and a shirt. The afternoon died away, and the circular spots of sunlight moved steadily over the green frond, and the brown fiber with no sound came from behind the rock. And at last, Ralph wormed his way out of the ferns and sneaked up towards the edge of that impenetrable thicket that fronted the neck of the land. He peered with elaborate effort through the branches at the edge, and could see Robert sitting on guard at the top of the cliff. He held a spear in his left hand and was tossing a pebble up and catching it again. Behind him, a column of smoke rose thickly, so that Ralph's nostrils flared and his mouth dribbled. He wiped his nose and mouth through the back of his hand, and for the first time since morning, felt hungry. The tribe must be sitting around the gutted pig, watching the fat ooze and burn among the ashes. They would be intent. Another figure, an unrecognizable one, appeared by Robert and gave him something, then turned and went back towards the rock. Robert laid his spear on the rock beside him and began to gnaw between his raised hands. So the feast was beginning, and the watchman had been given his portion. Ralph saw that for the first time he was safe. He limped away through the fruit trees, drawn by the thought of the poor food, yet bitter when he remembered the feast. Feast today and then tomorrow. He argued unconvincingly that they would let him alone, perhaps even make an outlaw of him. But then the fatal, unreasoning knowledge came to him again. The breaking of the conch and the deaths of Piggy and Simon lay over the island like a vapor. These painted savages would go further and further. Then there was that indefinable connection between him and Jack, who therefore would never let him alone. Never. So Ralph has realized that at this point, he knows where this is going to end up, right? At some point, they're going to try and kill him. He paused, sun-flecked, holding up a bough, prepared to duck under it, and a spasm of terror set him shaken, and he cried aloud, "No, they're not as bad as that. It was an accident." And he ducked under the bough, ran clumsily, and then stopped and listened. He came to the smashed acres of fruit and ate greedily. He saw two little ones and, not having any idea of his own appearance, wondered why they screamed and ran. When he had eaten, he ran towards the beach, and the sunlight was slanted now into the palms by that wrecked shelter. There was the platform in the pool. The best thing to do was ignore this leaden feeling about the heart and rely on common sense, their daylight sanity. Now that the tribe had eaten, the thing to do was to try again. And anyway, he couldn't stay here all night in an empty shelter by the deserted platform. His flesh crept and he shivered in the evening sun. No fire, no smoke, no rescue. He turned and he limped away through the forest towards jack ends of the island. The slanting sticks of sunlight were lost among the branches, and at length he came to a clearing in the forest where rocks prevented vegetation from growing. Now it was a pool of shadows, and Ralph nearly flung himself behind a tree when he saw something standing in the center. But then he saw that the white face was bone, and the pig's skull grinned at him from the top of the stick. He walked slowly to the middle of the clearing and looked steadily at the skull, and gleamed white as ever as the conch had done, and seemed to jeer at him cynically. So again, this is the Lord of the Pigs, right? Which represents like the devil and anarchy. An inquisitive ant was busy in one of the eye sockets, but otherwise the thing was lifeless, or wasn't. Little prickles of sensations ran up and down his back, and he stood, the skull about on a level with his face, and held up his hair with two hands. The teeth grinned, the empty sockets seemed to gaze masterfully and went without effort. What was it? The skull regarded Ralph like one who knows all the answers and won't tell, and a sick fear and rage swept him. Fiercely, he hit out at the filthy thing in front of him that bobbed like a toy and came back, still grinning into his face, so that he lashed and cried out in loathing. But then he was licking his bruised knuckles and looking at the bare stick, while the skull lay in two pieces, its grin now 6 feet across. He wrenched the quivering stick from the crack and held it as a spear between him and the white piece. And then he backed away. Keeping his face to the skull that lay grinning at the sky. So this is him rejecting that evil part of humanity, right? When the green glow had gone from the horizon and the night was fully accomplished, Ralph came to the thicket in front of the castle rock, and peeping through, he could see that the height was still occupied, and whoever it was up there had a spear at the ready. He knelt among the shadows and felt his isolation bitterly. They were savages, it was true, but they were human, and the ambushing fears of the deep night were coming on. Ralph moaned faintly. Tired though he was, he could not relax and fall into a well of sleep for fear of the tribe. Might it not be possible to walk boldly into the fort and say, "I've got packs," laugh lightly and sleep among the others, pretend they were still boys, schoolboys who had said, "Sir, yes, sir," and worn caps? Daylight might have answered yes, but darkness and the horrors of death said no. Lying there in the darkness, he knew he was an outcast. Because I had some sense. So again, this is exactly how Piggy felt, right? I'm an outcast because I had sense and I'm all alone.
And who is this?
This is Ralph. He rubbed his cheek along his forearm, smelling the acrid scent of the salt and sweat and staleness of the dirt. And over to the left, the waves of the ocean were breathing, sucking down and boiling back over the rock. And there were sounds coming from behind the castle rock. Listening carefully, detaching his mind from the swing of the sea, Ralph could make out a familiar rhythm: kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood. The tribe was dancing. Somewhere on the other side of this rocky wall, there would be a dark circle, a glowing fire and meat. There would be savoring food and the comfort of safety. And a noise near at hand made him quiver. Savages were clambering up the castle rock, right up to the top, and he could hear voices. He sneaked forward a few yards and saw the shape of the top of the rock change and enlarge. There were only two boys on the island who moved or talked like that. Ralph put his head down on his forearms and accepted this new fact like a wound. Sam and Eric were part of the tribe now. They were guarding the castle rock against him. There was no chance at rescuing them and building up an outlaw tribe at the other end of the island. Sam and Eric were savages like the rest. Piggy was dead, and the conch smashed to powder. At length, the guard climbed down. The two that remained seemed nothing more than a dark extension of the rock, and a star appeared behind them and was momentarily eclipsed by some movement. Ralph edged forward, feeling his way through the uneven surface as though he were blind. There were miles of vague water at his right, and the restless ocean lay under his left hand, as awful as the shaft of a pit. And every minute the water breathed round the death rock and flowered out into a field of whiteness. Ralph crawled until he found the ledge of the entry in his grasp, and the lookouts were immediately above him, and he could see the ends of his spear projecting over the rock. He called out very gently, "Sam and Eric." And there was no reply. To carry, he must speak louder, and this would rouse those striped and inimical creatures from their feasting by the fire. He set his teeth and started to climb, finding the holds by the touch. The stick that had supported a skull hampered him, but he would not be parted from his only weapon. He was nearly level with the twins before he spoke. Sam and Eric. He heard a cry and a flurry from the rock. The twins had grabbed each other and were gibbering. It's me, Ralph. Terrified that they would run and give the alarm, he hauled himself up until his head and shoulders stuck out over the top. Far below his armpit, he saw the luminous flower around the rock. It's only me, Ralph. At length, they bent forward and peered into his face. We thought it was, we didn't know what it was. We thought memory of their new and shameful loyalty came to them. Eric was silent, but Sam tried to do his duty. You've got to go, Ralph. You go away now. And he wagged his spear and essayed fierceness. You shove off, see? And Eric nodded agreement and jabbed his spear in the air. Ralph leaned on his arms and did not go. I came to see you two. His voice was thick. His throat was hurting him now that he had thought it had received no wound. I came to see you two. Words could not express the dull pain of these things. He fell silent on the vivid stars which split and danced all ways. And Sam shifted uneasily. Honestly, Ralph, you'd better go. And Ralph looked up again. You two aren't painted. How can you? If it were light. If it were light, shame would burn at them at admitting these things. But the night was dark. Again, darkness is a mask as well. Eric took up, and then the twins started their antiphonal speech. You got to go because it's not safe. They made us. They hurt us. Who, Jack? Oh, no. They bent towards him and lowered their voices. Push off, Ralph. It's a tribe. They made us. We couldn't help it. And when Ralph spoke again, his voice was low and seemed breathless. What have I done? I liked him, and I wanted to be rescued. Again, the stars spilled out the sky, and Eric shook his hand earnestly. Listen, Ralph, never mind what's since. That's gone. Never mind about the chief. You got to go for your own good. The chief and Roger. Yes, Roger. They hate you, Ralph. They're going to do you. They're going to hunt you tomorrow. But why? I don't know. And Ralph, Jack, and the chief say it'll be dangerous, and we got to be careful and throw our spears like at a pig. We're going to spread out in a line across the island, and we're going to go forward from this end until we find you. We got to give signals like this. And Eric raised his mouth and achieved a faint illusion of beating on his open mouth. And then he glanced behind him nervously. Like that, only louder, of course. But I've done nothing, whispered Ralph. I've done nothing, whispered Ralph, urgently. I only wanted to keep a fire. He paused for a moment, thinking miserably of the morrow. A matter of overwhelming importance occurred to him. What are you? He could not bring himself to the specific at first, but then fear and loneliness goaded him. When they find me, what are they going to do? The twins were silent, and beneath him, the death rock flowered again. What are they? Oh God, I'm hungry. The towering rock seemed to sway under him. Well, what? The twins answered his question indirectly. You got to go now, Ralph, for your own good. Keep away as far as you can. Won't you come with me? The three of us would stand a chance. And after a moment's silence, Sam spoke in a strangled voice. You don't know Roger. He's a terror. Only the chief. They're both terrors. Only Roger. And both boys froze. Someone was climbing towards them from the tribe. And so just as a side note here, so what ended up happening, Roger basically tortured the two twins. Is kind of what happened. And Roger was actually even crueler than Jack was at this moment. Someone was climbing towards them. He's coming to see if we're keeping watch. Quick, Ralph. And as he prepared to let himself down the cliff, Ralph snatched up at the last possible advantage to be run out of this meeting. I'll lie up close in that thicket down there, he whispered. So keep them away from it. They'll never think to look so close. And the footsteps were still some distance away. Sam, I'm going to be all right, aren't I? And the twins were silent again. Here, said Sam suddenly, take this. And Ralph felt a chunk of meat pushed against him, and he grabbed it. But what are you going to do? What are you going to do when you catch me? And silence above. He sounded silly to himself, and he hung himself down the rock. What are you going to do? So he's going to be hunted and killed tomorrow. From the top of the towering rock came an incomprehensible reply. Roger sharpened a stick at both ends. So the only times we've seen a stick sharpened at both ends is when they put a head on it. So they're going to offer him, like, they're going to put his head on it like the pig. And Roger sharpened a stick at both ends. Ralph tried to attach a meaning to this, but he could not. He used all the bad words he could think of in a fit of temper that passed into yawning. How long could you go without sleep? He yearned for a bed and sheets, but only the whiteness here was the slow spilt milk luminous round the rock 40 feet below where Piggy had fallen. Piggy was everywhere, was on his neck, was become terrible in darkness and death. If Piggy were to come back now out of the water with his empty head, Ralph whimpered and yawned like a little one. The stick in his hand became a crutch on which he reeled. And then he tensed again. There were voices on the top of the castle rock. Sam and Eric were arguing with someone, but in the ferns and the grass were near. That was the place to be in, hidden and next to the thicket that would serve for tomorrow's hideout. Here, and his hands touched grass, was a place to be in for the night, not far from the tribe, so that if the horrors of the supernatural emerged, one could at least mix with humans for the time being, even if it meant. And so his plan is he's going to hide right beside the ladder in a really like dense jungly area. And he told the twins to keep everyone away from it. So what did it mean? A stick sharpened at both ends. What was there in it? They had thrown spears and missed, all but one. Perhaps they would miss next time too. And he squatted down in the tall grass, remembered the meat that Sam had given him, and began to tear at it ravenously. While he was eating, he heard fresh noises, cries of pain from Sam and Eric, cries of pain, angry voices. What did it mean? Someone besides himself was in trouble for at least one of the twins, and at least one of the twins was catching it. And then the voices passed away down the rock, and he ceased to think of them. He felt with his hands and found cool, delicate fronds backed against the thicket. Here was the knight's lair. At first light, he would creep into the thicket, squeeze between the twisted stems, and conceal himself so deep that only a crawler like himself could come through. And that crawler would be jabbed. There he would sit. The search would pass by, and the cordon waver on, ululating along the islands, and he would be free. He pulled himself between the ferns, tunneling in, and then he laid the stick beside him, and he huddled himself down in the blackness. One must remember to wake at first light in order to diddle the savages, and he did not know how quickly sleep came and hurled him off towards a dark interior slope. And he was awake before his eyes were open, listening to a noise that was near. He opened an eye, found a mold an inch or so from his face, and figures gripped into it. Light filtering between the fronds of the ferns. He had just time to realize that the age-long nightmares of fallen and death were past, and that the morning was come. When he heard the sound again, it was an ululation over the seashore, and now the next savage answered, and the next. The cry swept by him and across the narrow end of the island from sea to the lagoon, like the cry of a flying bird. He took no time to consider, but grabbed his sharp stick and wriggled back up among the ferns. Within seconds, he was worming his way into the thicket, but not before he had glimpsed the legs of the savages coming towards him. The ferns thumped and were beaten, and he heard legs moving in the long grass. The savage, whoever he was, ululated twice, and then the cry was repeated in both directions, and then died away. Ralph crouched still, tangled in mid-break, and for a time he heard nothing. At last he examined the break itself. Certainly no one would attack him here, and moreover, he had a stroke of luck. The great rock that had killed Piggy had bounded into this thicket and bounced there, right in the center, making a smashed space a few feet in extent either way. When Ralph had wriggled into this, he felt secure and clever. He sat down carefully among the smashed stems and waited for the hunt to pass. Looking up between the leaves, he caught a glimpse of something red. That must be the top of Castle Rock, distant and unmenacing. And he composed himself triumphantly to hear the ends of the hunt dying away. And yet no one made a sound, and as the minutes passed in the green shade, his feeling of triumph faded. At last he heard a voice, Jack's voice, but hushed. Are you certain? The savage addressed said nothing. Perhaps he made a gesture, and Roger spoke. If you're fooling us. Immediately after this, there came a gasp, a squeal of pain, and Ralph crouched instinctively. One of the twins was there, outside the thicket, with Jack and Roger. You're sure he meant in there? And the twin moaned faintly and then squealed again. He meant he'd hide in there? Yes, yes, oh. And silvery laughter scattered among the trees. So they knew. So he told Sam and Eric where he was, and they eventually gave him away, probably through torture. Ralph picked up his stick and prepared for the battle. But what could they do? It would take them a week to break a path through the thicket, and anyone who wormed his way in would be helpless. He felt the point of his spear with his thumb and grinned without amusement. Whoever tried that would be stuck, squealing like a pig. So even though they know he's there, they can't really do anything, right? He's in such a deep spot, in such a narrow spot, that they can't get to him. And if they do try, they're defenseless. Well, he can just poke at them. They were going away, back towards the Tower Rock. He could hear feet moving, and then someone sniggered. They came again, that high bird-like cry that swept along the line. So some were still watching for him, but some, and there was a long, breathless silence. Ralph found that he had bark in his mouth from the gnawed spear, and he stood and peeped upwards to the castle rock. And as he did so, he heard Jack's voice from the top. Heave, heave, heave. The red rock that he could see at the top of the cliff vanished like a curtain, and he could see figures in blue sky. A moment later, the earth jolted, and there was a rushing sound in the air, and the top of the thicket was cupped with a gigantic hand. The rock bounded on, thumping and smashing towards the beach, and while a shower of broken twigs and leaves fell on him, beyond the thicket the tribe was cheering, and silence again. Ralph put his fingers into his mouth and bit them. There was only one other rock up there that might conceivably move, but that was half as big as a cottage, big as a car, a tank. He visualized its probable progress with agonizing clearness, that one would start slowly, dropping from the ledge, trundle along the neck like an outsized steamroller. Heave, heave, heave. Ralph put down his spear and picked it up again. He pushed his hair back irritably and took two hasty steps across the little space and then came back. He stood looking at the broken ends of branches in still silence. He caught sight of the rise and fall of his diaphragm and was surprised to see how quickly he was breathing. Just left of his center, his heartbeats were visible. He put the spear down. Heave, heave, heave. A shrill, prolonged cheer. Something boomed up on the shred rock. The earth jumped and began to shake steadily, while the noise as steadily increased. Ralph was shot into the air, thrown down, dashed against branches. At his right hand, only a few feet away, the whole thicket bent and the roots screamed as they came out of the earth together. He saw something red that turned over slowly as a mill wheel, and then the red thing was past and the elephantine progress diminished towards the sea. Ralph knelt on the plowed up soil, waiting for the earth to come back. Presently, the white broken stumps and the split sticks in the tangle of thickets refocused. There was a kind of heavy breathing in his body, where he watched his own pulse. Silence again. Yet not entirely so. They were whispering out there, and suddenly the branches were shaking fiercely at two places on his right. The pointed ends of a stick reappeared, and in a panic, Ralph thrust his own stick through the crack and struck with all his might. Ah. His spear twisted a little in his hands, and then he withdrew it again. Ooh. Someone was moaning outside, and a babble of voices rose. A fierce argument was going on, and a wounded savage kept groaning. Then there was a silence. A single voice spoke, and Ralph decided that it was not Jack's. See, I told you, he's dangerous, and the wounded savage moaned again. What else? What next? Ralph fastened his hand round the chewed spear, and his hair fell. Someone was muttering, only a few yards away towards Castle Rock. He heard a savage say no in a shocked voice, and then there was suppressed laughter. He squatted back on his heels and showed his teeth at the wall of the branches. He raised his spear, snarled a little, and waited. So again, they tried to crush him with rocks. They couldn't. They tried to stab him with spears. They couldn't. He is safe in this little enclave. Once more, the invisible group sniggered, and he heard a curious trickling sound, and then a louder crepitation, as if someone were unwrapping great sheets of cellophane. A stick snapped, and he stifled a cough. Smoke was seeping through the branches in white and yellow wisps. The patch of blue sky overhead was turning to the color of a storm cloud, and then the smoke billowed round him. Someone laughed excitedly, and a voice shouted, "Smoke." He wormed his way through the thicket towards the forest, keeping as far as possible beneath the smoke. Presently, he saw an open space, the green leaves at the edge of the thicket. A small savage was standing between him and the rest of the forest, a savage striped in red and white, while carrying a spear. He was coughing and smearing the paint about his eyes with the back of his hand, as if he tried to see through the increasing smoke. Ralph launched himself like a cat, stabbed, snarling with the spear, and the savage doubled up. There was a shout from beyond the thicket, and Ralph was running with the swiftness of fear through the undergrowth. He came to a pig run, followed it for perhaps several hundred yards, and then swerved off. Behind him, the ululation swept across the island once more, and a single voice shouted 3 times. He guessed that this was the signal to advance and sped away. Again, his chest was like fire. Then he flung himself down towards under a bush and waited for a moment till his breathing steadied. He passed his tongue tentatively over his teeth and lips and heard far off the ululation of the pursuers. There were many things he could do. He could climb a tree, but that was putting all his eggs in one basket. If he were detected, they had nothing more difficult to do than wait. If only he had time to think. Another double cry at the same distance gave him a clue to their plan. Any savage balked in the forest would utter a double shout and hold up the line till he was free again. That way they might hope to keep the cordon unbroken right across the island. Ralph thought of the boar that had broken through them with such ease. If necessary, when the chase came too close, he could charge the cordon while it was still thin, burst through and run back. But run back where? The cordon would turn and sweep again. Sooner or later, he would have to sleep or eat, and then he would awaken with hands clawing at him, and the hunt would become a running down. What was there to be done? The tree burst the line like a boar. Either way, the choice was terrible. A single cry quickened his heartbeat, and, leaping up, he dashed away towards the ocean side and a thick jungle till he was hung up among the creepers. And he stayed there for a moment with his calves quivering. If only one could have Pax, a long pause, a time to think. And there again, shrill and inevitable, was the ululation sweeping across the island. At that sound, he shied like a horse among the creepers and ran once more till he was panting. He flung himself down by some ferns, the tree or the charge. He mastered his breathing for a moment, wiped his mouth, and told himself to be calm. Sam and Eric were somewhere in that line and hating it, or were they? And supposing, instead of them, he met the chief or Roger, who carried death in their hands. So he's really feeling like this pig now. Again, if you think about it, there's been a couple hunts. One of the hunts where they chased after a pig and the pig kept running until eventually it just ran out of steam, right? Oh, if only I had a moment to think. If only I could think. If only I could think. If I had a rest. One of the other hunts as well was the boar that charged at them. That boar died too, as well. So either way, he knows where this is going.
That's Ralph hiding
Yeah,
away.
yeah, he's hiding away right now. Ralph pushed back his tangled hair and wiped the sweat out of his best eye, and then he spoke aloud. Think. What was the sensible thing to do? There was Piggy to talk. There was no Piggy to talk sense. There was no solemn assembly for debate nor dignity of the conch. Think. Most, he was beginning to dread the curtain that might waver his brain, blacken out the sense of danger, making a simpleton of him. A third idea would be to hide so well that the advancing line would pass without discovering him. He jerked his head off the ground and listened. There was another noise to attend to now, a deep grumbling noise, as though the forest itself were angry with him. A somber noise across which the ululations were scribbled excruciatingly as on slate. He knew he had heard it before somewhere, but he had no time to remember. Break the line, a tree, hide, and let them pass. A nearer cry stood him on his feet, and he immediately was away again, running fast among the thorns and the brambles. And suddenly he blundered into the open, found himself again in that open space. And there was a fathom-wide grin of the skull, the no longer ridiculing a deep patch of blue sky, but jeering up at a blanket of smoke. And then Ralph was running beneath the trees, with the grumble of the forest explained. They had smoked him out and set the island on fire. Hide was better than a tree because you had a chance of breaking the line if you were discovered. Hide then. He wondered if a pig would agree and grimaced at nothing. Find the deepest thicket, the darkest hole on the ground. Find the deepest thicket, find the deepest hole, darkest hole in the ground, and creep in. And now as he ran, he peered about him. Bars and splashes of sunlight fitted over him, and his sweat glistened streaks on his dirty body. The cries were far now and faint. And at last he found what seemed to be to him the right place, though the decision was desperate. Here, bushes and a wild tangle of creeper made a mat that kept out all light of the sun. Beneath it was a space, perhaps a foot high, that was pierced everywhere by parallel and rising stems. If you wormed into the middle of that, you would be 5 yards from the edge and hidden unless the savage chose to lie down and look for you. And even then, you would be in darkness. And if the worst happened and he saw you, then you had a chance to burst out at him, fling the whole line out of step, and double back. Cautiously, his stick trailing behind him, Ralph wormed between the rising stems, and when he reached the middle of the mat, he lay and listened. The fire was a big one, and the drum roll that he had thought was left so far behind was nearer. Couldn't a fire outrun a galloping horse? He could see the sun-splashed ground over an area perhaps 50 yards where he lay, and as he watched, the sunlight in every patch blinked at him. This was so like a curtain that flapped in his brain for a moment. He saw the blinking was inside him. And then the patches blinked more rapidly, dulled and went out, so that he saw a great heaviness of smoke lay between the island and the sun. So they lit the island on fire, and the fire's growing. If anyone peered under the bushes and chanced to glimpse the human flesh, it might be Sam and Eric, who would pretend not to see and say anything. He laid his cheek against the chocolate-colored earth, licked his dry lips, and closed his eyes. Under the thicket, the earth was vibrating very slightly, or perhaps there was a sound beneath the obvious thunder of the fire and the scribbled ululations that was too low to hear. And someone cried out. Ralph jerked his head off the earth and looked into the dull light. They must be near now, he thought, and his chest began to thump. Hide, break the line, climb the tree. Which was best after all? The trouble was you only had one chance. Now the fire was near, and these volleying shots were great limbs, trunks even, burst in. The fools, the fire must be almost at the fruit trees. What would they eat tomorrow? Ralph stirred restlessly in his narrow bed. One chance, nothing. What could they do? Beat him? So what? Kill him? A stick sharpened at both ends. The cry, suddenly near, jerked him up, and he could see a striped savage moving hastily out of a green tangle, and coming towards the mat where he hid. A savage who carried a spear. Ralph gripped his fingers into the earth. Be ready now, in case. Ralph fumbled to hold the spear so that it was at the point foremost, and he saw the stick was sharpened at both ends. And now he saw the stick was sharpened at both ends. The savage stopped 15 yards away and uttered his cry. Perhaps he can hear my heart over the fire, noises of the fire. Don't scream. Get ready. The savage moved forward so that you could only see him from the waist down. There was the butt of his spear, and now you could see him from the knees down. Don't scream. A herd of pigs came squealing from the greenery behind the savage and rushed into the forest. Birds were screaming, mice shrieking, and a little hopping thing came under the mat and cowered. 5 yards away, the savage stopped, standing right by the thicket, and cried out. Ralph drew his feet up and crouched. The stake was in his hand, the stake sharpened at both ends, that stake that vibrated so wildly, that grew long, short, light, heavy, light again. The ululation spread from shore to shore, and the savage knelt down by the edge of the thicket, and there were lights flickering in the forest behind him. You could see a knee disturb the mold. Now two hands, a spear, a face. A savage peered into the obscurity beneath the thicket. You could tell he saw light on this side and on that, but not in the middle, there. In the middle was a blob of darkness, and the savage wrinkled up his face, trying to decipher the darkness. The seconds lengthened. Ralph was looking straight into the savage's eyes. Don't scream. You'll get back. Now he's seen you. He's making sure. A stick sharpened. Ralph screamed, and a scream of fright and anger and desperation. His legs straightened. The scream became continuous and foaming. He shot forward, burst the thicket, was in the open, snarling, bloody. He swung the stake, and the savage tumbled over, but there were others coming towards him, crying out. He swerved as the spear flew past, and then was silent, running. All at once, the lights flickering ahead of him merged together. The roar of the forest rose to thunder, and a tall bush directly in his path burst into a great fan-shaped flame. He swung to his right, running desperately fast, with the heat beating on his left side and the fire racing forward like a tide. The ululation rose behind him and spread along, a series of short, sharp cries. The sighting call. A brown figure showed up on his right and fell away. They were all running, all crying out mildly. He could hear them crashing in the undergrowth on the left, and on the left was the hot, bright thunder of the fire. He forgot his wounds, his hunger, his thirst, and became fear, hopelessly fear on flying feet, rushing through the forest towards the open beach. Spots jumped quickly before his eyes and turned into red circles that expanded quickly till they passed his sight. Below him, someone's legs were getting tired, and the desperate ululation advanced like a jagged fringe of menace, and was almost overhead. So again, below him, someone's legs are getting tired. His legs are getting tired. He stumbled over a root, and the cry that pursued him rose even higher. He saw a shelter burst into flames, and the fire flapped at his right shoulder, and there was a glitter of water. Then he was down, rolling over in the warm sand, crouching his arm up to ward off, trying to cry for mercy. He staggered to his feet, tense for more terrors, and looked at the huge peaked cap. It was a white-topped cap, and above the green shade of the peak was a crown, an anchor, gold foliage. He saw white drills, and epaulettes, a revolver, and a row of gilt buttons down the front of a uniform, and a naval officer stood on the sand, looking down at Ralph in wary astonishment. On the beach beneath him was a cutter, sheer bows hauled up and held by two ratings. In the stern sheets, another rating held a machine gun. The ululation faltered and died away. The officer looked at Ralph doubtfully for a moment, then took his hand away from the butt of his revolver. Hello. Squirming a little, conscious of his filthy appearance, Ralph answered shyly, hello. The officer nodded as if a question had been answered. Are there any adults, any grown-ups with you? And dumbly, Ralph shook his head. He turned a half pace on the sand, a semicircle of little boys, their bodies streaked with a colored clay, sharp sticks in their hands, were standing on the beach, making no noise at all. Fun and games, said the officer. The fire reached the coconut palms by the beach and swallowed them noisily. A flame, seemingly detached, swung like an acrobat, licking up the palm heads at the platform. The sky was black. So what's happened is, well, they saw the smoke and they came to rescue them. The officer grinned cheerfully at Ralph. We saw your smoke. What have you been doing? Having a war or something? And Ralph nodded. The officer inspected a little scarecrow in front of him. The kid needed a bath, a haircut, a noise wipe, and a good deal of ointment. Nobody killed, I hope. Oh, any dead bodies? Only 2, and they've gone. The officer leaned down and looked at Ralph. 2 killed? Ralph nodded again. Behind him, the whole island was shuddering with flame. The officer knew, as a rule, when people were telling the truth, and he whistled softly. Other boys appeared now, tiny dots of them, brown, with distended bellies of small savages. One of them then came to the officer and looked up. But there was no more to come. Percival Wemyss Madison sought in his head for an incantation that had faded clean away. The officer turned to Ralph. We'll take you off. How many of you are there? Ralph shook his head. The officer looked past them to the group of the painted boys. Who's boss here? I am, said Ralph loudly. A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair, who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist, started forward, then changed his mind and stood still. We saw your smoke, and I don't know how many of you there are. So again, so Jack said, heard, oh, I'm chief, Ralph's chief. And he's about to correct him. It's like, well, no point. We saw your smoke, and you don't know how many of you there are. No, sir. I should have thought, said the officer as he visualized the search before him. I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you, would have been able to pull up a better show than that. I mean, it was like that at first, said Ralph, before it stopped. We were together then. And the officer nodded helpfully. I know, jolly good show, like the Coral Island. Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment, he had fleeting pictures of the strange clamor that he'd once invested on the beach. But the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had. The tears begun to flow, and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now for the first time on the island. Great, shuddering spasms of grief that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke beyond the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion too. The other little boys began to shake and sob too, and in the middle of them, with a filthy body, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of a true, wise friend called Piggy. The officer, surrounded by these noises, was moved and a little embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together, and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance. And so that's our novel. And so again, this Navy officer looks at them. He's like, you guys are all just playing fun and games, right? I would have thought you guys would have been able to organize yourselves and become sensical. And one of those last sentences there, again, Ralph weeps for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, the fall through the air of the true, and a wise friend called Piggy. So, one of the themes of this novel is the true death of innocence. So we're going to complete our character arc here. And then we'll take a break then, and we'll kind of finish this book. I do not know if we'll extend this into Tuesday. I will see. I will think. 1 second. I have quite literally 1,000 things open. Okay, so really quickly, let's do our plot summaries here. So chapter 11, basically, the four boys confront Jack. They confront Jack. Sam and Eric are taken. Jack and Ralph fight. We saw a hint of lethal force at first, right? And the first spear did try to kill him. After that, they didn't try to kill each other. But then Roger executes Piggy. Right? Using that great big boulder. And Ralph runs away from an attack. So then in chapter 12, which is our final chapter, basically Ralph hides and learns he will be hunted and offered to the beast, right? That double pointed stick. That's what they're sticking the heads upon to offer to the beast. In doing so, he gets hunted. The island is lit on fire. Sorry, I know I'm black on here. So the island's lit on fire in an attempt to flush him out. Ralph gets chased. He ends on the beach, exhausted and moments from death. Again, he's on this beach. There's nowhere else to run. Everyone's right behind him. They see him. He would be dead in a minute. So that's it. He's over. He has no more strength in his legs. Everyone's behind him. He's too hurt. They're full savagery. He's dead. And what do they see? He's eventually saved by the Navy. They get rescued. And at this point, we see a complete loss of innocence. You know, imagine that, going back to Maine society, to regular society after living through that, seeing what people are capable of, and especially such a short time.
Lost don't say that pretty good.
Sorry?
A TV show Lost.
I need to watch that. Yeah, like these are often compared to each other, and I haven't watched it.
It's 92 hours of from first to end.
Is Lost, does it have a really good ending or a really bad ending? I'm trying to remember. It's one of the two.
People don't like it. I didn't mind it because I didn't mind it at all. People have their own preferences. So.
And then we'll quickly go to our characters and our iconic items, and then we'll head for our break.
That's girl left for
Okay, so let's go through this stuff here. So at this point, we've kind of gone through everything. We see that, so Ralph occasionally descends into savagery. Right? He did descend into violence at Jack. You know, that wasn't their goal. You know, he was insulted him instead of no, we're just here for the glasses and fire. Every time he does this, though, he's called back by Piggy, called back civilization to properness by Piggy. And at the end, he becomes distraught by humans, right?
would be just like distraught by adults because they haven't, or just humans.
I think just humans, because like again, like everyone on that island, save for Jack, was, they were kind. Like there was nothing off about them, but every single person descended into that savagery. So it's not just adults, it's not just kids. He realizes that when pushed into certain situations, humans will do evil, terrible things, and they will do it quickly. We see countless examples of that in like films. Like if you ever look at any film with like an apocalypse or like, a war going on, you'll see that. The Last of Us is a good example of that if you watch that show. We have Jack. There's nothing more to really add there. He's just a dick. He's completely cruel. With Piggy, the one thing to kind of note here is, well, he dies, but one of the themes of this thing is that brutality and violence beats intelligence and rationalism. And also, he clings to the conch, civilization, because it's the only way he has any voice and power, right? Even in his last moments, he was clinging to that conch. He was trying to like, hey, I have the conch, let me speak, let me speak. Simon, we're not going to add much more there. Again, Simon was the first person to really realize what's going on inside of everyone. Simon was the first person to really recognize this like symptoms of darkness and savagery. But he didn't have the vocabulary or confidence to properly convince people of that or even tell people of it. So now we have Roger. So Roger was pretty absent throughout the story, except for, I'm going to throw some rocks at people, but I'm not going to hit them intentionally. So Roger eventually ends up becoming Jack's right-hand man. We know he kills Piggy. And not only does he kill Piggy, this is the first intentional murder. Simon was not entirely intentional. That was then when they were fully descended into savagery, they kind of got shocked into it. They eventually realized, but Piggy was 100% intentional. And not only that, when you're in a crowd, there's less accountability on you. There's a reason that when there's firing squads happen, they line up like 10 soldiers, they give 5 of them real bullets and 5 of them not. It's to help alleviate that consciousness of it. When you're in a crowd, it's easier to disassociate. When you do it yourself, you're the murderer. So what does Roger represent? He represents cruelty. Represents cruelty and evil. Oh, sorry, he also tortured the twins. So now we have the twins. I haven't talked about what they represent. So before that, so these twins, Sam and Eric, they're pretty easily manipulated. Let's not go with manipulated, easily controlled. And they all along, they struggle to do what is right versus conformity. The earliest example we saw of this was when they joined the hunt. Well, no, Ralph told us we have to watch the fire. No, we need you for the hunt. And this is when, you know, the fire got let out. They didn't see the ship and stuff. So Sam and Eric represent, you know, they represent sheep, basically, like the sheep of society who just go along with like the edges and flows. They can be easily manipulated or controlled. Think about like the sheep in Animal Farm, for example.
One's bad or like.
Yeah. Um, the only ones we really have to add at the end are, well, actually, there's two. The conch and the fire. So with the conch here, at the end, it gets shattered at the end. You know, that represents, of course, total loss of society. And then the fire. So the fire comes back one last time. Of course, the entire freaking island's on fire, right? You know, what could that have any possible relevance to do? So the fire represents bringing people together. It represents bringing people together. It represents, you could argue that represents order in society as well and the urge to be rescued, but it also has this power of bringing people together. Only in this point, it brought the group together to kill Ralph. It brought the savages together. Just for the sake of space, that's all I can type. But so the fire was used at the very, very end because it brought everyone together, but not for good intentions. Um, and I won't add more, but again, you talk about Piggy's glasses. When savage societies have technology, it turns a weapon of mass destruction. What lit the island on fire, right? It was Jack. Jack is, you know, he's madness. He's madness incarnate. And you give him the power to do something, he destroys everything. There's one character that I've not put on here. Can anyone guess what that is? We've not talked about what they represent in the story. Well, actual correct, but not what I'm thinking of. Actually, there's two. The little ones. All those little ones on the island, the ones that were uncounted for. So when at the last chapters, when it's just Sam, Piggy, when it's just Ralph, Sam, Piggy, and Eric, there's also all these little ones here, and they're throughout the story. So these represent the weak in society or the ones who need to be protected. If you think about this, you know, how did Jack react to them? He hated them, didn't want them around, didn't really care about them. Whereas Piggy and Ralph, they're trying to count them, they're trying to make sure they're okay. You know, they're not any, they don't help the actual islands run. They don't do their job. They're not really able to take care of themselves. They need help. And that's kind of, you know, that's what's referenced here, is that in Jack society, in one of savagery, they're not taken care of. They're not cared about. In one of, you know, dignity, there is care towards there. And then finally, of course, we have our third murder. We will go for a break after this one. We have murder 3, which is, of course, Piggy. And Piggy was an intentional execution. But why is this important to the story? When this happens, when Piggy is intentionally killed, there are two things that happen. One, there's total loss of innocence. There's blood on the hands now. At least with Simon, you had the crowd mentality. And you had regret afterwards. You had sadness afterwards. Now, Piggy gets killed, and they immediately try and kill Ralph. And it's not just Jack, it's not just Roger. We see 3 spears thrown, right? So 1, there's a total loss of innocence, and 2, murder is now okay. It is accepted. Sorry, I lied. Just one more thing. The beast. The beast is within everyone. The beast is referenced a whole lot. In this case, the beast represents the darkness of the group on the island. It represents the darkness of human nature. It represents the darkness of this group of boys on this island. And after that, we'll go for break. So we're just going to finish up some of the booklet stuff here. I specifically want to go over, oh God, where did I put it? Where did I put it? That yes, but I want to go over the hunts first. So there's 6 hunts throughout it, and they have deeper significance here. It's when the group breaks down more and more. So at chapter 8, we have that mother's sow that was slaughtered. This is the hunt that Ralph joins in on. Ralph joins in this hunt. And not only does he join in it, he actively participates. He's excited about it. He actively participates. And in doing it so, he becomes a follower of Jack with this. And other people are seeing this. So this is a way to actually start to, not erode his leadership, but it empowers Jack's leadership. So that's the consequence of this one. And then, of course, we know that this is where the Lord of the Flies comes from. It's this pig's head. And also, this encourages fear of the beast, right? Now, at the time, they think the beast is this physical entity. The beast itself, though, is the descent into savagery, right? And this is, again, where Ralph joined in on this. Ralph stopped caring about the fire and other things. He immediately went in to join on this and got excited about it. That crowd mentality that we see. And then in chapter 9, we see that this beast, quote unquote, gets killed on the beach. The beast, of course, was Simon, right? Sorry, this is where Simon was murdered. And how come? He was murdered because the group went into a frenzy and savagery. everyone saw and heard that it was Simon during it. Now, the problem with this is that this encouraged group mentality. This encouraged the group, a group mentality where it is okay to do bad things, right? You're doing it as a group. You don't carry that burden by yourself. It's not one person killing Simon, it's 20. And then finally, of course, we get to chapter 12 where Ralph is the hunted. The group descended into full savagery. Intentional individual murder is okay. So again, where these come into play is when we look at it from the big picture. Right from chapter 1, we start from hesitating to kill an animal that they would use for food. There's hesitation towards that to it's starting to slowly break the ties that bind people together. We start to hide behind masks where we can do bad things. We start to see the leadership breakdown. We start to see people's fear of something. You can use fear to control things, right? Remember an Animal Farm? The fear of Mr. Jones coming back is what erodes power. The fear of the beast is what erodes power. It's where Jack really starts to take foothold of something. So now we'll do those themes. Now we'll touch on those themes. That's it, up past these questions here. So we got 1, 2, 3, there should be 6 of them. Yes. We got a bunch of themes here. There are more than this, but these are the most commonly cited ones, of course. So all we want to do is we just want to know a sense or two about how they're present in the play. What's their relevance to this? And so with civilization versus savagery, again, you could put whatever you'd like here. It's open to interpretation. It's visible a lot. I'm going to try and keep it simple rather than go really complicated. But basically, can everyone see? Is that too small? I'll just make it bigger anyways. So we start together as a civilization and society, right? There's jobs, there's a leader, they hold organized meetings, etc. Over time, the group descends into savagery. And not only that, you can use fear, or we'll just say bad interests can can use fear. Bad groups, maybe sometimes that's a political leader in the real world. It's a terrorist organization, etc. But bad interests, bad groups, bad people, etc., can use fear to control and sway society. If Mr. Jones, the threat of Mr. Jones wasn't around, if the threat of the beast wasn't around, we might have seen completely different outcomes of this. So individualism and communism, right? Being a person versus being part of a community. Sorry, I know you're still writing, so I'll just. So when we're dealing with as an individual, so as individuals, Jack's a really good example of this. Jack and Hunton, focus more on their personal goal of having fun in Hunton. Versus the collective goals of the group. Things like building a hut, stopping fears, creating order, right? Listening to Ralph and Piggy. So next, loss of innocence. I don't think much needs to really be talked about this. Again, we eventually see, every boy, but especially Ralph and Piggy, but especially Ralph, sees the darkness in humanity and people, right? The loss of innocence, whereas murders, slowly escalate. The unwanteds in society are ignored or tortured. Again, like how do you go back, live into life untraumatized when he was 30 seconds away from being killed? Like they were right behind him. He was on his back on the sand. He was crying for mercy until he saw the Navy officer. He saw Piggy, a guy who collectively tried to do right. He was pretty logical. He seemed pretty nice. Get murdered for trying to do the right thing, right? Complete loss. We have our struggle to rebuild society. So again, at first, the goal is to create an orderly community. They're trying to mirror the old civilization they had, right? Where we have rules and laws and we let people speak one at a time. But over time, primal, or let's put savagery, keep it consistent. Over time, savagery emerges and threatens this order. It takes work to do this. It takes work and commitment from many people to maintain society. Ralph and Piggy couldn't do it by themselves. They needed other people. So next we have man's inherent evil. This is humanity. So basically, over time, society is, I'll use the word eroded. It gets erased. And as this happens, cruel behaviors emerge and become the norm, right? They become normal. It becomes normal to treat Piggy like crap. It becomes normal to use power and violence to get what you want. So Jack, represents this at first, but slowly all the other boys follow in his footsteps, right? The biggest symbol of this, of course, the symbol of this is the beast. Again, the beast is not a physical thing. The beast is something that's inside everyone here. The beast is their inherent darkness. It's those urges to do those bad things that they have to control, that society checks in place. So finally, we have mob mentality, and it's through the mob, it's through a group that, I guess, chaos and violence, bad behavior, whatever you want to use, chaos and violence slowly become more accepted. The biggest example of this, of course, is Simon's death. We have the pig chant, right? Kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood. We have the hunt reenactments. If you remember, I think it was Simon. I forget who exactly. Actually got hurt in those, right? Like they were actually like poking at him and stuff. Like they were hurting him. It went from theatrical to like they kind of got too involved in it. And then of course the other example is the hunt on Ralph. Okay. Okay, so that's it. I don't think we're gonna extend this into Tuesday. I would love to. It's a really good thing to write about. I don't think we're gonna have time. We only have we have 5 days to get through Hamlet, so there will not be an assignment with this.
Is it shorter than this one?
Hamlet itself is shorter. Well, the book, not only is the book thinner, like this is pure text in there. Hamlet is not, but Hamlet is more difficult in just reading it. This book tends to have like the hardest like the most difficult like vocabulary, and like I think he goes on and on about like, what the island looks like. Hamlet is shorter, and I think the themes are a bit simpler, but you have to get through that language barrier, which is the issue. Yeah, we're gonna power through Hamlet. Normally we go pretty slow. We watch a film. I don't know if we're gonna have time.
School on Monday.
There's no school Monday. That's correct. So all that's gonna kind of happen here is, again, I'm not gonna take this in for marks just for the sake of time. There are, of course, these questions here. If you want to do those, great. The big things I would say to focus though on are these, the deepen your understanding parts. So now that we've kind of read out the novel, what would you put here? And you won't have time to answer it all in fully well fleshed out things. You could even put a template for each of these if you want. But a couple really big themes here, of course, are there's question 2, right? Your individual beliefs. How does that conflict with society? That's a big part of what this course is about. How does evil and power originate from? And then pessimism, optimism. This is a huge book to write about.
What is that? I know what optimist.
Pessimist is like looking down on it. It's like, oh, what's the point about buying a lottery ticket? I'm just gonna lose anyways.
What's my brother's.
So number 4 is specifically really good to write about. You will almost certainly be asked a question about how a character or a group's pessimism or optimism towards something affected how they interacted throughout the story. So that's a really big one to kind of focus on here. So I would say number 2 and number 4 are the big ones you really kind of want to clue in on here, but they're all pretty good. But 2 and 4 are the big ones. There's a very strong chance you'll be writing about questions that ask something similar to this. And this could be a really good tool to kind of lean on with that. Lord of the Flies is almost like, it's something that's basically written about every single person writes about it. It's so universal. It's a really flexible piece to work with. Because you have a bunch of characters, right? You have Sam and Eric, who are sheep, you have inherent evilness, you have like the call of society, you have pessimism, you have optimism. So I'll give you guys some time for that.